Okay, welcome to this introduction to Net Zero Business Academy 12 and a half kick-ass sustainability ideas, where I pick 12, I think, very powerful ideas for you to accelerate sustainability in the year ahead. Quick introduction to me. I don't think I know many of you. My name is Gareth Kane. This is a much younger picture of me. I got told off for using it, but it's a picture of me with my first book. I have written 5. The Green Executive, probably the one I'm most proud of those. I was actually starting to write another book recently, but it turned into a podcast, being a middle-aged man. So there's a picture of me with much more realistic levels of grey. We've been running the Net Zero Business Podcast for a year, and I love it. I've learned a huge amount from it, so I'd encourage anybody to sign up. My company is Terra Infirma Limited. We mainly do sort of strategy and engagement. We have a thing called the Net Zero Accelerator, where we take moribund strategies and give them a kick up the backside, although that usually involves employee engagement. And professional development is a big stream of what we do, and that's where Net Zero Business Academy fits in. And as well as this taster, we have 10 webinars, 1 hour long, on a particular topic. And this taster will give you a flavor for all of that. When we rebranded it last year as Net Zero Business Academy, we added a module session on offsetting, and that was probably got a little bit of space in it. So I'm going to briefly talk this year about the need for climate adaptation as well. And I will talk about that a bit later. Here's some companies and organizations who have sent people to or it says Green Academy, it should be Net Zero Business Academy. But most of them signed up to it under its previous name, Green Academy. Nissan were on Net Zero Business Academy last year. Right, that's the little bit of advertising to get past in the first place. But before we get on to the 12 and a half ideas, the workbook. Now, this is a really important bit of Net Zero Business Academy because we all know the webinars we go on and they sound a bit interesting, and then about halfway through you lose interest and start checking your emails and stuff, and that's no good use of anybody's time. So what we do is we have this workbook, and the idea is you fill it in as you go along and apply the thinking to your organization. So for the taster, just to get you started, we have one main exercise. We use this in one of the other webinars. Most of them will have 3, 4, 5 exercises within them. But this will give you a flavor for how it works. So each of the ideas, if you write down how you might apply that in your organization, or if you're a consultant, how you might apply it in a client's organization. Then we do a very quick and dirty assessment of it. What's the opportunity? What are all the upsides? And they are high, medium, and low. You get to define that, not me. And risk, meaning all the downsides. You know, is this going to cost a lot? Might this go horribly wrong? All that sort of thing, high, medium, low. And then we will use those to assess them, your ideas afterwards. Okay. So I will whip on back to the presentation and we will get on with the ideas. Oh, I should have said, if you have any comments, please, and he says, opening the chat box, stick them in the chat. And then I will stop at an appropriate place and respond to that comment, answer the question, whatever it might be. We have a bit more time for doing this in the normal sessions. They don't tend to be as quick fire as this one. So 12 and a half kick-ass sustainability ideas. The first one is the idea of the sweet spot of success. I like a good Venn diagram, and this is the basis of session 1, looking at the business case. And a lot of people say, well, I understand the business case. And I'm going, no, what's the business case as it applies to your organization? You know, apart from the fact that you're on a moral mission to save the planet, from a more practical point of view, what are the pressures on the business to go this way? You know, is it to save money? Is it to engage your employees? Is it to work with your customers? Because depending on what the answer to that question is the whole strategy should follow that, because then you get a win-win situation. And when you succeed in sustainability or net zero, your business gets a boost as well. And, some people are a bit awkward about this. Even some people think that an organization, if they do something and it's good for their business, then it's greenwash. To me, that's nonsense. No, it has to be win-win. It has to be good for the planet and good for your business. And in that session, we will go through the business case in detail, from compliance up to exploiting new markets in the low carbon economy. We won't go through that today, but have a think about which of these might be the biggest business driver to embrace sustainability, net zero. Which of them makes more market? Because obviously, if it's new markets, that's a completely different thing from cost saving. I'll give you an example of why it's important to get this right. One of my clients is a brand you'll know, but I'm not going to name them here. They found that their biggest pressure was keeping their customers happy, so winning and retaining business, and yet the business was under quite strict return on investment requirements in any project that they wanted to do, and those two are incompatible, because it's very hard to guess what the return investment is on keeping a customer. You could do it in theory, but it becomes a lot more difficult. So it's making sure all these things are properly aligned. Okay, so that's idea number one. Idea number two, and this is the easiest way to get sustainability moving in your business, is to remove any of the green tape that might be holding them back. Again, some sustainability people, particularly those who feel on a real moral mission, and I'm on a moral mission, but I try not to let it cloud my judgment, they almost think that we have to force people to jump through hoops, that we should make them earn the right to be green or sustainable. Obviously, that's nonsense. But one of the best things you can do is take away any barriers to doing the right thing. Here's an example. Back before the days of COVID, when everybody started using Zoom, the companies, if they wanted to do teleconferencing, would have a teleconferencing suite that you would have to book, and then you would go and use it, and the people at the other end of the meeting, they'd have to book theirs, and you'd all sit in these rooms. And the one in this company was just gathering dust. Nobody was using it. And I was running a workshop with their employees, which I will come to later. And somebody started ranting and raving about this. I said, I'll tell you why I don't lemon use it. Sweary. It's because in order to book it, you have to estimate the cost of the meeting you're not having. So this was so the company could work out how much money they were saving through the teleconferencing system. But it was easier just to book a meeting room, put out a calendar invite, and then everybody would come and you wouldn't have anything more to do, instead of you having to do all these sums in order to use the teleconferencing. Now they cut that. They just decided, right, well, we're not doing that anymore. And within a few months, they had to double the capacity of the teleconferencing system, because it was being used so much. So that extra little bit of bureaucracy that was put in for all the right reasons, but it was actually pushing people in the wrong direction. So the absolute easiest thing you can do to make sustainability happen is remove any obstacle like that. In your workbook, if you can think of anything that really annoys you, stick it in there as the practical output of this idea. Number three is how to sell sustainability to absolutely anyone. And I'm sure you've done the thing where you stand up in front of an audience with a presentation, you make this passionate case about why the organization, why the individuals should do sustainability, and you just get blank looks, or they just nod and then ignore you. It's very frustrating. Now, how I do this, and this works really well in the boardroom, absolutely brilliantly, is I get a flip chart, blank sheet of paper. I write, why are we here at the top of it? I'm not talking about the sort of metaphysical reasons for existence. I'm asking, why should this organization take sustainability seriously? And then I do the most important thing. I shut up and I wait. And I wait and I wait. And I wait until somebody says something. And inevitably, if you leave it for long enough, somebody will crack and say legislation or keeping employees happy. And I write that down. If it's legislation, I might ask which legislation. If it's employees, saying what are your employees asking for? Some sub questions to flesh this out. But I won't finish asking them for all the reasons they should take sustainability seriously until the flip chart is at least 1 page full, maybe 2. And the amazing thing is that it takes obviously a lot longer than putting up my business case for sustainability slide that I had before, but they sell sustainability to themselves. And people trust themselves far more than they trust me or you. It's human nature. And it's particularly good in the boardroom because you don't want to go in there and say, look, you're doing business all wrong. You have to do it this way. You go in and say, why should we be embracing this? They think it through. They sell it to themselves. You will find action starts to happen much more quickly. It works absolute treat. If you've ever been in one of my workshops, whether it's in person or online, I inevitably, unless it's the second workshop, if it's the first one, I will start it with that exercise because it works really well. So again, your workbook, if you can think of a situation where you can do that, either in a formal setting or somehow informal, and just ask a question, it's really, really effective. Okay, idea number 4 is involve people. And this is a sort of development of that. And I do a lot of workshops for this very good reason. But here's a quote that's usually attributed to Benjamin Franklin. Like most quotes you find, may not be as accurate the attribution as you might hope for. But tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. And a lot of my work revolves around workshops, getting people really developing solutions themselves. And I do the facilitation, maybe a bit of a nudge in the right direction. And again, it's that same psychological thing as selling sustainability to themselves. If they've developed the ideas, then they are far more likely to pick up the ball and run with them. I once did a workshop for some senior managers. It wasn't the boardroom, but it was senior managers on a Friday afternoon. By Monday lunchtime, the head of procurement, who was in the workshop, had banned single-use plastics in the cafeterias in this organization, because that's an idea she had as a quick win in the workshop. And it happened in less than 24 working hours. It happened in half a day. It was, and that's because you're getting people, as John Friedman says, this is from Friday's episode, this Friday Cummings episode of the podcast. He said, you need to get their skin in your game. So John works along similar lines to me. So if they own what the solution is, they're far more likely to implement it. So again, your workbook, if you can think of a way you can exploit that psychological thing, then do it. The other thing about workshops is you'll soon find out about the barriers that you get. So going back to idea number 2, to remove all the hoops and green tape, people will tell you why they don't do stuff, and you should listen to them and remove those barriers, as that thing about the teleconferencing came out of that, and a whole lot more. I could give you a raft of similar examples. You've got to remove the barriers, but I'm going back on that one. But in this case, if you involve people, you will pick up positive solutions and you will pick up lists of things to fix. Right, which takes me on to more engagement using what I call green jiu-jitsu. And the jiu-jitsu analogy is, I find that most sustainability thinking is like, people trying to punch each other's lights out. So they, it's adversarial. You're telling people what to do, they push back, and you're trying to persuade them, all that sort of thing. It's not a very pleasant environment. In jiu-jitsu, I'm told, and I've never studied jiu-jitsu, you adjust your technique to the strength of your opponent. So if your opponent comes at you fast, then you will use that momentum against them, or against them in inverted commas in our case. So it's about working to people's strengths rather than working to their weaknesses, which sounds a bit airy-fairy. I will explain it another way. I said I like the Venn diagram. If you can find the overlap between sustainability and the interests of your audience, then you will get their attention. So I first developed this when I was working with one of the country's major engineering companies. I'm an engineer. They wanted me to go in and talk to the engineers about recycling more at home and switching the TV off properly at night and all that stuff. And I said, I'm not going in there and talking to these people who deal with high-tech products day in, day out, how to switch their TVs off properly. So I would been sort of working with this idea of co-creation of solutions, all they involve people stuff. And I realized that people were engaged through that. So I said, okay, if you want to engage engineers, let's treat this as an engineering problem and get them to come up with solutions. And it worked an absolute treat. Now, if you're wondering, is there always an overlap? I say, yes, there is almost always. I've always found an overlap. And here's two examples from the press. Apologies for the quality of the pictures. Donald Trump has said that climate change is a hoax and a con job here. In a project in Ireland to protect one of his golf courses, Donald Trump has said that they're suffering rising sea levels associated with global warming. Donald Trump loves golf. If the climate change is threatening a golf course, he loves golf and he loves making money from golf courses as well, that will get his attention. No, you could say, okay, it's a flunky somewhere along the line doing it, but it just caught my attention. The other one is a headline. It was on the front page of the Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph, which I think we're all UK based or based in Northern Europe, but the Telegraph is the most climate skeptic of all the press in the UK. And yet here on the front page, they're saying climate change threatens to devastate the value of hundreds of thousands of homeowners' properties. So they don't care about the polar bear. They don't care about the attribution of extreme weather. But when it comes to house values, the Telegraph and their readers are interested. So you can always find that button to press. You can always find that overlap between sustainability and the interest of your audience. And I think I showed on that the typical engagement just goes all in for the sustainability side of thing without thinking about the audience. So it goes outside their sphere of interest. And if they're not already interested in sustainability, you're not going to get them interested at all. So Green Jiu-Jitsu, it's all about which buttons we press, the language we use to engage people, the images we use to engage people, the activities we use to engage people. It's absolutely everything. You align it to your audience. And that is probably the cleverest idea I've ever had. Other people have stumbled upon this by chance, but I haven't come across anybody who's given it a name before, so I gave it the name Green Jiu-Jitsu. Right. Moving on from engagement, let's talk a bit about supply chains. Close a loop. And you might be asking why I've got a picture of a fishing net. Well, I've changed around my slides every year, so I've taken one out to fit some others in. Interface Floor, one of my clients, and I think the people who do sustainability the best, they're the biggest carpet tile manufacturer in the world. They have a premium product which is made out of old fishing nets. A third of all ocean plastics are from discarded fishing gear, so they collect in the fishing gear, or their supply chain does, and converts it into carpet. As a result of that, the same product has become available for lots of other applications. If any of you buy things from Alpkit, some of their swimming costumes are made from the same material. It used to be a fishing net on a third world beach. It's now your swimming costume. If you take this thinking all the time, you can extract resource from virtually anything. because of the way that the platinum in catalytic converters in cars degrades over time, road sweepings actually have a higher concentration of platinum than the ore that we mine for virgin platinum. There's also all sorts of things you can take out of human waste, including gold, that would maybe surprise you. And more companies are working out ways of commercializing this and making it happen. But we can close these loops if we really try. Now, the circular economy is this idea of having a closed loop economy in the same way as there's no waste in nature. You know, we have the water cycle, the oxygen cycle, carbon cycle, et cetera, et cetera. Where I think people get the circular economy wrong is they think it means more recycling. But when I've worked with companies who get this right, like Interface, they see it as a way of getting sustainable raw materials. If you use it for sustainable raw materials, then you create the demand for those materials and the economy will adjust to match that. And you will get higher value and lower costs and more security of supply. Whereas if you look at it from a waste management point of view and try and use the waste hierarchy and all that sort of thing, it drives the, you're trying to push stuff into a loop, and if there's nothing pulling out the other end, then the loop gets blocked. So you have to focus on raw materials. So just think about where you can purchase stuff that is from a secondary source, because then you're making the circular economy happen. Okay, that was idea number 6. I have been gambling on because we had a slightly late start. If you have any questions, please make sure you bang them into the meeting chat. I will hang around afterwards. I'm not going to run away at 3. I will hang around afterwards if you've got any burning questions, because of the technical problems at the start. If you want to fire through any emails afterwards, please do, and I will answer those questions as best I can. I will make it good. Okay, moving on then to targets, and we're going to have a couple on targets and strategies. Almost every organization has a net zero target now, net zero by 2030, 2040, 2050. 90% of the world's economy has some sort of net zero target associated with it. But one of the problems with net zero is it's very vague. You know, it is, we reduce carbon emissions as much as possible, and then we offset the rest, as you can see in this diagram. Now, the main alternative is what we call science-based targets, which are promoted by the Science-Based Target Initiative, which is a spin-off of the UN. And this says, okay, if you want to contribute to the Paris Agreement targets of 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, a maximum of that, above pre-industrial levels, then this is the trajectory your business will need to do to contribute to it. And what I've been finding, particularly through the podcast, is the best companies are combining the two. So they say, okay, the big totemic, I should click on to and SBTs, the big totemic target is the net zero one, the one that we'll put at the front of any brochure. But underneath, we use the science-based targets to get the correct trajectory to get us down to 1.5 if everybody else did the same. And then that offsetting bit, it doesn't matter so much. And we will come on to offsetting in a minute, but obviously offsetting is very controversial. So the best in sustainability are using both. They have a net zero target, and then they underpin that with a science-based target. And you might want to hide that away and keep it for the technical people. You know, you might not want to be pushing that out to, you know, if you're a business to consumer type company, pushing it out to consumers, you could mention it, but the idea of sort of a 45.8% cut by 2030 or whatever might not appeal to them as much. A bit of green jiu-jitsu, pick and choose what you decide to communicate. But the best, as I say, are doing both. Right, I think I'm getting back on time, so I can slow down a little bit here. Number 8, which is related to this, is stretch yourself. And you can't do a high jump by trying to do lots of little jumps. You have to go for one big jump. And the same happens in sustainability. A lot of people will either have incremental targets on cutting carbon, like they'll say, we are going to cut our carbon 2% year on year. Or even if they've got an 80 or 90% target for a particular time, they translate that back into incremental targets. Don't do this. Don't allow other people to do it. It's a fool's errand, because you will run out of 2%. You will be chasing a zillion quick wins. You will run out of time. You will use all your effort trying to track them all down and implement them. And you will get diminishing returns, because there's only so much you can squeeze out of the system before you have to change the system. So incremental targets will not get you any close to net zero. It's a fallacy, and people do it. As I say, they either deliberately do it or they do it by default, or, we'll get onto this in a minute, but what they do is they will list 100 actions that will cut their carbon footprint without really thinking, are we seriously cutting it, or are we just tinkering around the edges? So you can very quickly feel you're doing a lot of work, a lot of good stuff, and you're going nowhere. So what's the alternative? Stretch targets. Stretch targets do two things. They give you they focus your mind on the scale of the change required. Plus, because you've got that time frame in between them, it actually gives you time to implement the change. So particularly if you're a very asset-rich business, and you're not going to be able to change things quickly because you're going to have to plan capital projects, design, get all the approvals, build and commission them, then that takes time, and you have to give yourself time to do it. So stretch targets are definitely the way forward, and try and get people out of the way of incrementalism. You might have noticed one of my books at the start is called Accelerating Sustainability Using the 80-20 Rule. That basically says a small number of things will give you a lot more results, small number of significant things rather than a huge number of tiny incremental things. So the outputs really, if you're not setting a proper stretch target, or if it's sort of being converted into an incremental target, please deal with that. Okay, which takes us on to how to develop sustainability strategies. And this sounds a bit airy-fairy, create the future you want to see, but there are wonderful techniques to do it. But unfortunately, most of us don't use it. We use what's effectively forecasting. So we look at our environmental impact going forward, and in this case, it would be rising under business as usual. And then we implement a number of policies that we think will bend the trend and hopefully get us down to that green box at the bottom, which is sort of an arbitrary definition of sustainability. And that gets us into that sort of incremental diminishing returns issue. So I use a technique called backcasting, which was popularized by the natural step movement in the mid-90s. And I've got the natural step book that explained it to me in the background there. So we don't worry about business as usual. We start at the end. So that orange star there saying endpoint, we define what the organization would look like if we meet our sustainability targets. And that is a wonderful exercise. It really focuses people's minds. And this is perfect as well, I should say, before I go on, for group work, so the Involve Me stuff. So I do this with the boardroom of my clients to make sure they understand what you're trying to achieve. Then you step backwards to an intermediate stage, usually halfway, and you say, okay, what that might be 5 or 10 years' time. What will we have to achieve by then to be on track for that endpoint? And then you go back to today and say, what do we have to start doing now to get onto that intermediate stage? And this gets us into those step changes that I was talking about before, which will help me stretch targets. So backcasting, group work, and stretch targets, 3 of our ideas, all work together really nicely. So this is one of the times you might want to hide away your science-based targets, because they give you a trajectory, which kind of implies incremental improvements year on year rather than big step changes. You might want to keep that to yourself in some cases and just give people the intermediate SBTs that you can link to these intermediate stages in the backcasting process. And this is really powerful. It gets people away from all the day-to-day stuff that might make them feel they can't move, and gives them a real impetus towards the stuff that really makes a difference. So I use this all the time. I absolutely love it. I recently came across it in a book which is featured in Friday, the podcast episode Friday week, and they were calling it Future Back. It's a different name for it, which I hadn't heard before. I've always called it backcasting. And I was really pleased to see it, because I thought I was the only one who was really using it, because people say to me, oh, I've never done that before. One of the great things about this is it makes sustainability fun. Actually doing that strategic planning is really cool, and people really like it. You know, I remember one client, it was just after Brexit, and the position of their main site was such that they were worried that the lorries backing up from Dover would completely block their only exit. That was the issue they were dealing with before we went on to do my session. And I thought, when I was listening to them, I thought, I'm never going to get them out of this, because this is immediate and catastrophic. But they absolutely loved the mental break from getting away from the day-to-day and looking into the future and say, okay, here's a vision. How are we going to achieve it? It works really, really well. And I'll give you a little example of that at the end. Right. Number 10, wield the axe. And I often say this is the litmus test of sustainability, and it's where things get difficult, because we're not going to get a sustainable economy just by green growth. We need to destroy the brown economy. Likewise, within an organization, we're not going to get net zero by just doing additional green stuff. We have to just stop doing the bad stuff as well. And this is really difficult, and this takes a lot of commitment. The best companies see it as creative destruction, as I've put there, that they deliberately will either cancel a product that will never be sustainable, or they will put a time limit on it to develop a replacement. And I talked about Interface Floor before. Nigel Stansfield, Senior Director, he says, we have deliberately deleted products which are not going to progress us towards our Mission Zero goal. That's their sustainability goal of they've gone past it now, zero impact on the environment by 2020. For example, we've eliminated a number of products with a flame retardant, but because they said that's never going to match with sustainability. So they just stopped doing it, even though it's profitable. So that's tough. That's the difficult, at the start, we were talking about removing barriers to sustainable behavior. That's easy. This is difficult. But again, if you get people into the backcasting frame of mind, it's a way of doing it, because most of these decisions will have to be made, or certainly sanctioned, at a top level. Okay, just another time check. We're doing okay. I don't have to gabble quite so much. Okay, this is a new one. I mentioned adding adaptation into the syllabus. We'll just be doing a very, very brief bit on it. But, you'd have to be living under a rock not to know about the fires that are scorching across California at the minute. And less graphically, they've been flooding across the world as well. And it's starting to focus people on what's really the Cinderella of sustainability, which is adapting to the climate change that's already baked into the system. Because even if we cut carbon emissions to zero tomorrow, there's still this sort of delay in the response of the environment, and we will still have a lot of these problems. And that's why we're seeing them increasingly today. I should say that picture is of California, but it was actually taken a few years ago. The current picture, I make a point of paying for my stock photos, and the current ones are still in sort of press levels of having to spend lots of money, whereas I was able to get this one cheap. But it's pretty much the same thing. Now, a lot of people doing adaptation think of what my podcast guest last week, Rupert Read, calls shallow defensive adaptation, but we need much more than that. We need to be looking at removing these problems at source and building our resilience. So one of the problems with California is the houses are built out of very flammable materials, and they should be built out of inflammable materials to stop the fire traveling down a neighborhood house to house. Obviously, the flooding in the other picture, there's a whole question about where we locate factories, because think of that. I was trying to work out if that was a factory or school or whatever it might be, but let's pretend it's a factory. If that's in your supply chain and it's at risk of flooding, then what impact has that got on your business? So we're going to have to start doing a full value chain assessment of the climate risks and decide how we're going to mitigate those. So as well as decarbonisation, I know you've all got a lot on your plate. We really got to knuckle down and get into adaptation. I've only done a little bit of adaptation work for Newcastle Hospitals Trust. I'm based in Newcastle, that's where I'm sat at the minute. The top picture is Newcastle under the likely sea level rises. This database, whose name escapes me just at the minute, will do this worldwide. So because the River Tyne sits in quite a deep gorge, there aren't that many places where it's going to have a real risk. But over near the blue blob, if you can see my mouse moving, this blue blob here, the A1 crosses the Tyne on a flyover. So it's largely up above the Tyne. So in terms of access into the hospital, it's probably okay, but there would be so much water around the footings of that flyover. It could have structural problems. Part of the road could wash away. It is a risk that they're having to look at. The map at the bottom is of the Royal Victoria Infirmary site, one of the two main hospitals in Newcastle. The other one's up on high ground. But the RVI, as it's known, it was built on the course of an old stream, which is now culverted, but it still means that all the topography of the surrounding area leads water into the center of the RVI site. So this map, it's a different database, shows exactly where the flood risks might be. And there's also some worrying things on the major road intersection over to the top right of that map. So those gives you an idea of the risk. Now, again, that is sort of the adaptation equivalent of Scope 1 emissions in a carbon footprint. You also have to start looking at the Scope 2 and 3 emissions, particularly Scope 3. Where are you going to get your power from? Where do your employees live? Where do your customers live? Et cetera, and start to worry about these things. But it really does need a lot more investment, or we're going to be in whole heaps of trouble. On that cheery note, let's talk about a controversial issue, which is offsetting. Net zero implies an element of offsetting. This is the most controversial area in sustainability, bar none. And we'll see the press reports like this revealed more than 90% of rainforest carbon offsets by biggest certifier are worthless, analysis shows. Now, the biggest certifier pushed back on this. It is a matter of debate. One of the things I find a bit funny about the offsetting controversy is that people are quite happy for what we call nature-based solutions like tree planting. But if you say, right, we're going to do that as an offset, then they start going, oh, it doesn't work. So, well, why doesn't it work if it's paid for that way? But it does work if it's paid for, out of the public purse. Part of the problem with this is that for various reasons that I don't have time to go into today, offsetting had become this very transactional thing where you throw money at one of these big offsetting brokers and they say, okay, we've factored in and cut a certain amount of carbon, which renders your carbon footprint at zero. And that is obviously fraught with all sorts of problems. It's a purely financial exchange, and it's very hard for the person purchasing the offset to make any kind of assessment of how effective it is. So even people within the offsetting industry will tell you the offsetting market is broken. We'll come on to that in a sec. The other thing that's leveled offsetting, and if you excuse the cliched meme, is this idea that that offsetting distracts you from carbon reductions. This is quoted all the time, and there doesn't seem to be, nobody's produced any evidence for it. You can get a couple of anecdotes, but the offsetting industry claim that their customers are far more likely to have a comprehensive net zero target and to be driving decarbonisation down through their value chains than people who don't offset. And to me, there's just as much logic for that if you're going to go to the bother of spending all this money on offsetting, then you're going to be A, trying to make sure you're only offsetting what you have to, and B, that you're very conscious of carbon emissions and climate change, et cetera, et cetera. A different way of thinking about offsetting is an internal carbon tax that's ring-fenced for a project. And what's emerging is sort of a second wave of offsetting type projects. So Aviva are investing £38 million in restoring temperate rainforest in the west coast of Britain in association with the wildlife trusts. So they've got those partners who want to make this happen for nature rather than make it happen just so that carbon turns up on a spreadsheet. It's a wonderful publicity requirement because they're not saying, oh, we offset our emissions and somebody we've never met is planting a tree in Peru to do that. It's saying we're doing something for the local environment, but if you read into the details, it is being done through an offsetting mechanism. Another company, Cundall, which is a construction company, they're developing what they call social decarbonisation as a form of offsetting. So they're saying to their customers, we will reduce your carbon footprint as much as possible. If you want to offset the rest, we will reduce the energy use in, say, a swimming pool in a deprived area, something with a community basis. So that not only cuts carbon, but it also has those social benefits by making that swimming pool more financially advisable. So these sort of enhanced offsetting schemes, you might want to call them, are coming out now, where it's much more working hand in hand. It's much less about just throwing money into a pot and hoping that it works. So these systems are working. And if you say, well, why do it this way? It is a vital source of funds for these projects. They wouldn't happen otherwise. So think of it as a carbon tax that is being ring-fenced for environmental projects. Okay, that's the 12th of our ideas. And there they all are in those conclusions. Finding the sweet spot of success, sort of really being very conscious of what the drivers are in your business, and they will change over time as well. Removing barriers to sustainable behaviors, the easiest way to get quick wins. Get people to sell sustainability to themselves is a wonderful little hack if you're doing engagement sessions. Involve people, so do engagement sessions, because if they've come up with the idea, they are far more likely to implement it than if you come up with the idea and try and persuade them to change what they do. Use Green Jiu-Jitsu, which is this whole idea of working within the culture of the organization rather than sort of trying to get people to be tree huggers. You have to put yourself in their shoes and think about their relationship with sustainability. Close a loop, and many loops that you wouldn't expect to be closed can be closed. They underpin net zero targets with science-based targets or similar. It doesn't necessarily have to be science-based targets, but have some scientific rigor, as well as that big sort of easy to grasp net zero target. Stretch targets, banish incrementalism is essential. I talked about backcasting, creating the future you want. Wielding the axe is the litmus test. Adapt or die. This is going to be shooting up the agenda this year, because we can't just keep allowing places to flood and throwing our arms up in the air and going whoops. And lastly, make offsetting work for you. And I forgot to say on that, you could do both. Is that if you're clever, you could, for example, pay for trees to be planted upstream of your facilities so that they provide flood protection. So you could do offsetting as a way of funding adaptation. These things are all possible. Okay, those are the 12 ideas. I hope you've been able to scribble some. I know all 12 of them mightn't apply to everyone, but I'm guessing that there are definitely a handful in there that will really help you change what you do. In terms of that, I had a moment, thought Zoom had completely frozen again. The 12 and a half one, because I didn't want to be too cheeky and put your own personal development in there as a full idea. The half one is your own CPD. We have 3 main mechanisms that we can help you with that. First of all, is the cheapest and easiest one, is our Net Zero Business Academy. The intermediate level one is we have a mastermind group, the Corporate Sustainability Mastermind Group, with just a meet in purpose, hence the pictures, post-its and stuff. More laterally has been meeting on a virtual basis. And this is where we get peer-to-peer learning and sharing of ideas. And that's a really powerful way to learn. I absolutely love it. So if you're interested in that, ask me about it. And lastly, the one-to-one coaching. Obviously, the more personal these things get, the more expensive they get, because it takes more resources to talk to more people. So, Net Zero Business Academy, just to remind you again, if you want to continue on with this, we have those 10 sessions. Each one of them, you'll get the workbook, you get to work through your system. You can see we'll go into, so for example, in April, that's a very popular one. We go into Green Jiu-Jitsu in much more detail, and you will develop your Green Jiu-Jitsu ideas. You will work those, that overlap in the Venn diagram out, and work out what buttons you can press with different people. You can apply it right down to individuals. I've done it before. So that is the program of this. If you want to take part in this, if you sign up before the end of January, you get all 10 sessions for 400 quid plus VAT. I will send out the link if you want to do that, with the recording of this. And I hope that whether or not you you want to continue on, I hope you got an awful lot of that out of that, and are taking those ideas. We're on 3 o'clock and I haven't actually finished, and people are leaving. But we will do the final bit of the workbook now. Forgot there was an extra session. This is what happens when you start 10 minutes late. Okay, those who are still with us, or those who are listening on the recording, if you mark those high, medium, or low, those ideas, if you put the number of the idea in the box, depending on the high, medium, low settings that you've given, or attributions you've given them. So just be careful, because the risk one goes high, medium, low, from left to right, whereas the opportunity is low, medium, high as it goes up. And then the idea is the assessment goes, the best ideas that you've translated for yourself go to the top right of that grid. So that's just a quick way of assessing them. And then the final exercise is the exercise we close every single session on. First question is, what are the 3 most important things you've learned today? So just really broad terms, really broad concepts. And then for each of those, think forward 6 months to a year and think, right, if I really went for this and it was successful, what would I be doing differently as a result in 6 months to a year? And then for each of them, the last 3 questions are, which 3 actions will you take first? And I'm talking about this afternoon, tomorrow, Friday, end of next week at the latest. So really, really tight things. It might be checking something out on the website. It might be arranging a meeting. It might be giving somebody a call, whatever it might be. So you go from the big hazy concept to a concrete vision of success, and then to the immediate actions. And that's a little mini backcasting exercise in itself. But that's how we finish every session in Net Zero Business Academy. Okay, I think we've lost a lot of people, but I am happy if you've got any questions to hang on for a bit. If not, I'd just like to thank everybody for taking part. And I hope you will join us for the whole year session, because, you know, I've given you a good flavor of the good bits, my favorite bits of it, but we have a lot more. You know, there's a lot more I have to leave out of that session as well. It's absolutely packed full of really practical thinking. But for now, I will say thank you very much for taking part in the session today.